Yo, everybody! It's the man, the myth, the legend. Dylan Spalding here, back with you, the host of Spalding Media Network. Happy to bring you your daily, or I guess weekly, I don't know how we're doing this here on the Purple Sector Podcast, F1 coverage here on this Sunday. It's 5 o'clock somewhere here in the state of Florida. I need to go grab a beer, actually. Hey, no speaking, Mr. Co-host. All right. Anyways, a couple housekeeping things before we introduce the host of the Purple Sector Podcast, Chris Everidge. Obviously, busy day of racing, IndyCar going on right now. I actually have it in the background. We also have other stuff going on as well. IMSA just finished up. Le Mans testing was happening today and others. But F1 is going to be the focus of this podcast. And with that being said, we're going to welcome in our host. Oh, and one other thing, I will be starting my racing career. Like a lot of these other guys, I'm going to be karting in a rental kart league. So that's another fun thing. All right. Anyways, without further ado, let's welcome in the man, the myth, the legend, the guy from around the block, none other than Chris Everidge.
Thank you. Charles' leg, just like his car today, missing half of the spot. All right. Thank you very much.
Little audio trouble.
We are looking for a new producer here on the Purple Sector Podcast. Just comment down your application below. We had a fantastic Canadian Grand Prix. We're going to talk all about it. We're going to go through a chronological order of kind of the timeline, and we're going to go on a team-by-team basis because there is just really a ton to talk about today. And our cover image here is, a happy Verstappen with the win and another terrible race for Perez. We'll get into it a little bit later on. But he has scored just 4 points in 3 races. And what's even worse is that we just found out that Yuki Tsunoda is being summoned to the stewards for being late to the national anthem. And I'm going to steal this one, but someone said he has short legs. It takes him longer to get there. And that is true. So let's start about the going on with this race here. Let's fast forward here to the start of the race where Haas just absolutely decided to do the opposite of everybody else. Everybody started on the intermediates. You can tell by this image, it was a little rainy. So Haas decided to start on the wet tires compared to the inters. And that obviously worked out because Hulkenberg went from like 15th to 9th. Magnussen went from 14th all the way to 4th place in the matter of a few laps. Got to the point Magnussen was the fastest guy on the track by 2 seconds, and we were all like, "Oh, is Haas going to win this race?" Obviously, that wasn't the case because Haas were extremely slow this entire weekend. They just did this. They threw a curveball out there, really, and it worked until it didn't, because then they had a pit for the intermediate tires that everybody else was on. So it was really just kind of fun to see this. But this race literally had everything, and it started off with this, with Haas going. So I'll throw this over to Dylan as a number one Haas supporter. Did you like the idea of them just throwing a curveball out there, doing the opposite of everybody else, the fact that it worked until it didn't?
Yeah, very interesting strategy for Haas. I think sometimes you got to go out of the box than everybody else. Sometimes you got to be the guinea pig to try stuff, and it may work, it may not work. In this case, it actually did work for Haas. Obviously, it only lasted for a little bit though, when it's everybody pitted and that kind of shuffled everything out. But it definitely was I like the strategy. I think it played well, and they definitely were very competitive early on in the race. I think if the strategy would have played out even better, maybe they could have found a way to try to move up and stay up towards the front of the grid. But I think with pit stops, it was going to be tough.
Yeah, they needed to keep raining more than it did, because yes, they were correct to go on the wet tires for the first 5 laps of the race. But between lap 5 and 20, it started to dry up. and it was just the wrong call. If it got to the point where I think what Haas were rooting for was for everybody to go to the pits because they realized it was too rainy, and then you would have Magnus and Hulkenberg like 20 seconds ahead of everybody else. It wouldn't have mattered because we had 3 safety cars this race. They would have got shuffled to finish scoring no points like they did. So let's move on to the next topic. This was it was more than a few laps later. If we can move on to the next topic. There you go. Once again, we are looking for a producer on the Purple Sector podcast.
Oh, shut up.
McLaren were literally, so it was Haas to start, and then it was McLaren. They were really the fastest when it started to dry, where it was at the point where it was in between like slick and intermediates. And it never really got to that point of being on the soft or dry tire, really. But McLaren were the fastest car at this point of the race. Now, what's really interesting is, especially about this race, there were points where Mercedes were the fastest. There were points where Verstappen was the fastest. Points where McLaren were the fastest. And Haas were the fastest. Like, that's why this race was just fantastic, because you never knew what was going to happen. At this point, it's like, oh, Lando's going to win this race. Piastri's going to get second. But that didn't end up happening because we ended up having a ton of safety cars. But this race had so many different storylines, and McLaren, they were fastest for a point. It didn't last. And so we can move on to our first sort of incident here. Logan Sargent again. Now, it's time to get rid of the Floridian. I'm a Floridian myself, but it's time to get rid of him. This, once again, he crashes himself. And this seems to happen way too much for Sargent. It's in the rain. He hops on a curb, and he spins out. And it's becoming too much. He's probably getting replaced by Carlos Sainz is kind of what the big rumor is. But it's just becoming too much for Williams to deal with when they have a fast car, and Sargent's just constantly hurting himself. And because of this Sargent crash that throughout the safety car, and another part of this topic here is Lando's pit troubles. Because what was very interesting is second, third, and fourth, I believe it was Piastri, Russell, Verstappen. They all went to the pits under the safety car. For some reason, Lando didn't. I say for some reason, it's probably because it was too close, because he was farther ahead of everybody. So because of that, he went from first to third, losing out on the pit strategy. And that's what we were saying kind of with this race. The fact that there were so many different points, so many different leaders. It went from Lando was probably going to win this race to like, oh, where's Lando going to finish now? But this was all before lap 25. Let's move on to our next incident, which is Charles Leclerc. Now this, like I said, this is what I'm saying with the shirt. This was very much Leclerc today. He was a shell of his former self. So this is really interesting what happened here. Now this is something that happens on like a video game. So it was raining, and Leclerc's like, oh, it's not raining anymore. Let me pit onto the dry tire. He runs 3 laps on the dry tire. He's 18 seconds a lap slower than the rest of the field. And then he goes back to the wet tires anyways. So he basically wasted an entire minute to go back to where he was in the first place. So terrible by Ferrari, terrible by Leclerc. Let's move on to more Leclerc news. Specifically, not Leclerc, actually. My bad. Maybe we need a new host as well. Okay. Lando stays out again. So literally what happened 10 minutes ago happens again because now Lando decides to stretch. He thought, since he had pitted a little bit later, that he can stretch out his intermediate tires a little bit longer, but that didn't work out. Verstappen had overtaken him. This is about halfway through the race here. Nothing really happening here, but let's move on to George Russell because George Russell made a big mistake, and this was something that Croft had said in the broadcast. Russell is a very fast driver, but he's making too many mistakes. So Russell was chasing down Verstappen for the lead. Now, little did he know that there was 25 laps left, and we were going to have another safety car. But Russell, really trying hard to catch up to Verstappen, ends up making a mistake on his own. And because of that, jumps the curb, kind of damages the car, maybe, we don't know. But that costed him 2 positions. And I'll throw this to you, Dylan. Just kind of, you don't pay attention to F1 as much as I do, obviously. What's your thoughts on Russell, just like from an outside point of view, like on the surface?
Yeah, so talking a bit about Russell, right? Obviously, Mercedes is committed to him because they just gave him a new contract. So I think Russell has talent. I don't know if that's a race-winning talent. I think he's a guy who will be a great guy to get you a podium. I don't know if he's up there with like a Lando or a Max or, one of the Ferrari drivers like a Leclerc, or in your case, Charles Legg. Uh, but nah, I mean, I think he's a good driver. I don't know if he's a top driver. And for what happened to him today, I'm going to give him this.
Well, you say he does. You say he's not a race winner, but literally, he's the last person that won a race for Mercedes, and he's the only one.
I know he's a race winner. I know he can win races, but he's just not.
It's these little mistakes. Like I said, you're in second place. You're chasing extremely hard to catch Verstappen. Then you make your own mistake, which cost you 3 or 4 seconds and positions that he later had to make up. So I do, yeah, from the surface level, like obviously, like Russell's a fast driver, but he's kind of making those little mistakes, those mistakes that you don't see Verstappen doing. So let's move on to someone who's making more than just little mistakes. He's making bad mistakes, and it's Checo Perez. Exactly. Not good enough. Perez, kind of like Perez and Sargent are more of the same. Like Perez has got just 4 points in the last 3 races. There's an 8th place, or it's a 7th place. But he's just casually driving. He's running his own race. He's in like 16th place, which is absolutely terrible. You got Verstappen winning races, and Perez is just getting 16th place. Crashes himself, spins out into the rear, breaks his wing, and then during that same lap, Carlos Sainz spins out and unfortunately takes out Albon, which was it was unfortunate for Alex. He didn't deserve that at all, but he got taken out. So in the span of 1 lap, you lost Perez, Sainz, and Albon. Which Sainz and Albon are going to be teammates next year, potentially. That's just what the rumor mill is saying. But check is not good enough. We'll talk about more of that later. Let's move on to the last kind of big story of the race, and that was Russell and Piastri tangling. This was a few laps to go. Once again, Dylan, another mistake, a little mistake from Russell because he's trying to make his way up and ends up, he didn't take out Piastri, but they tangled, lost a little bit of carbon fiber, and because of that, Lewis Hamilton ended up taking 3rd place. But Russell, who had more of the speed, passed him to get the podium at the end. But this is just, once again, another situation of Russell trying to be overly aggressive to the point where he's costing himself. He obviously was fast enough because he tangled Piastri. Lewis passed him, but then he ended up passing Lewis again. So this is another situation where Russell was faster than Lewis. Maybe Ferrari have hired the wrong driver, but we'll throw that out there. But still, just not good enough by Russell. He's making too many little mistakes. So your final podium, as you can see here, it's been an hour since the race ended, and literally I could not find a picture of the podium anywhere. So in the middle, you had Verstappen. To the left, you had Norris, and to the right, you had George Russell. So Lando, even after everything, still finished 2nd. He had a very fast car. Verstappen won this race, but really, how most times when Verstappen wins a race, you're like, oh, Verstappen won the race. Well, that's like Truex winning a NASCAR. I feel like I just wasted an hour and a half. But Verstappen, we won the race, but it was still a fantastic race. You had double points for Aston Martin, double points for Alpine, and Ricciardo got 7th. So that's kind of the chronological order. We're now going to go into kind of the team review, but before we do that, Dylan, what were your thoughts on the race?
Gonna keep it short and sweet. Great race, right there. It was a great race. It was good racing. I think the rain really did play a factor in terms of the strategy, and I think it created for what was an entertaining event. Maybe not as entertaining as my Porsche Carrera Cup, but hey, we'll take it. I'm just kidding.
All right, so we're introducing a new segment here. We're going to kind of split up the show a little bit. Team review. So we're going to go from whoever scored the lowest into whoever scored the highest. So in last place is a double DNF for the Williams. Like we said, Sargent crashed himself. Once again, not good enough by Logan. And then Albon really didn't deserve a DNF. You know, Logan was going to get 10th place in this race, 10th or 11th. It was him and Sainz. But he got taken out as part of Sainz's issue. So it's really unfair for Williams to get a double DNF here. They did have speed because before Sargent spun, he was in 15th. So, you know, that's still not good for Williams when you have Alex in 10th. But if Sargent's in 15th, you have a fast enough car, right? Because, you know, Sargent is, you know, we hate to say it, Sargent's obviously a fantastic race car driver. You know, Sargent's one of the top 20 drivers. But in terms of F1, he just is not cutting slack, really. But he was in 15th at a point. So Williams, it really is unfortunate that they got a double DNF. It really wasn't deserved. But because of that, they end up getting 10th. Let's move on to the team who got ninth place. And this one is very surprising. A double DNF for Ferrari? Really? I mean, you could kind of see it coming, though, because in qualifying, they both got knocked out. Like, neither one of them started in the top 10. Sainz spun out. He did it to himself, a rookie mistake. And Leclerc had an engine issue. He obviously had, as we talked about earlier, had a terrible pit strategy going on to the wet tires, then to the dry tires, then to the wet tires again. Ended up just retiring the car. Double DNF for Ferrari. Dylan, this doesn't look good on the brand, does it?
Yeah, definitely not a great performance for Ferrari. I don't know if I would say it doesn't look good for the brand, but I definitely think it's kind of been a whirlwind of a season, right? We know that Ferrari is going to be going kind of into a new era when they bring in Lewis Hamilton, so it's does make things kind of strange as we head into the next race on the schedule.
I mean, I think it does look bad for the brand because you have a point where Ferrari are 25 points behind Red Bull. Like, Ferrari have just won the last race at Monaco. Ferrari were the second fastest team. Like, Ferrari outscored, mostly because of Perez being terrible. Ferrari have outscored for Red Bull the last 3 races. So, like, you head into this race before the weekend, like, you could see Ferrari really challenging for the win here. And then all of a sudden we have a championship battle on our hands. And then they go and qualify terribly, and they double DNF. So I think it looks terrible for the team and the brand because we've almost now been robbed of a championship battle. Not that we had one to begin with, but, you know, Ferrari were supposed to be the second best team, and they double DNF. Like, Kick did better than them. Haas did better than them. Like, it's just not good enough for Ferrari, and I'm sure a lot of Ferrari fans will agree with me. Let's go to the team who got 8th place, and that would be Kick. Now, nothing exciting happened for them. They didn't score any points, but you know what they didn't do? They didn't DNF. So, woo! There we go. It's a non-DNF weekend for Kick. When's the last time that's happened? Valtteri and Joe, they didn't have any speed today whatsoever. They actually finished last on track, but hey, they finished like 14th and 15th because 5 other cars DNF. Woo! Let's go! Yes, we didn't get last, but you know why? That's because they finished last on track. But hey, 14th and it was a 13th and 15th or 14th and 15th. I don't actually know, but it doesn't matter. For a Kick, really just not good enough. By the team that has too many words in their name. They're supposed to be bringing in some more guys, but that's not good. So let's move on to Haas here, where they got 0 points, but it was exciting. Like we said, they did a different strategy than everybody else, and it paid off until it didn't. I think if we If the rain continued, Magnussen would have been in a good point. But once the pits rolled around, once we had safety cars, once everybody was on the same tires, it was pretty obvious that Haas were just not fast enough. And I think it was 13th and 14th. You wonder what it would have been if those other guys didn't retire. They probably would have been at the back with kick. So they end up scoring 0, which is actually a little surprising because Hulkenberg's had a few top 10s. Magnussen's had speed at points. You look where they were at the beginning of the race. They still scored 0. Dylan, I know we mentioned earlier that it was still worth the gamble. Are you a little surprised though that they ended up being as bad as they were, considering the first 10 laps of the race?
Not really. I mean, at the end of the day, they gambled on a strategy. It worked, but obviously the pit stops, shuffled them around a little bit. And for them, I think, it at the end of the day, Haas is either going to have, one of their drivers perform well or none of their drivers perform well. So, I mean, kind of not too surprised with their finish, although it's disappointing. I think they could have had a better performance for this.
It is. It very much reminds me of when Magnussen got on pole in Brazil a few years ago, and then obviously didn't do anything. It seems like Haas have a tendency of doing something exciting and being like, oh my, what are we witnessing? To then it just ends up being nothing. Like we said with Magnussen getting pole in Australia in 2020, they were 4th and 5th, and then they doubled DNF. Come on. And it's kind of the same thing here today. But, hey, they got quite a bit of TV coverage, which I'm sure the sponsors like. Let's move on to the teams. We're now getting into the point scoring. Good weekend for the Frenchman. Obviously, we had a lot of talk about Esteban, him potentially getting dropped. Jack Doohan ended up being in practice for Esteban. But it ended up working out 9th and 10th place. They bring in 3 points. This is another one of those situations where they probably wouldn't have scored points if you didn't have a double DNF by Ferrari and Checo being as bad as he did. But at the end of the day, you take what is given. And for Alpine, they have really struggled this year. And 3 points is going to be absolutely huge for them. It's going to, because they're battling in the back. That's just what it is. And they have a good driver lineup, and they really shouldn't be battling in the back. So you just take the points where you can get them. And that was the case today. They didn't necessarily have a ton of speed. They also weren't slow. They kind of were just in the middle of the pack the whole time, and then it ended up working out where they can get 9th and 10th. So good race for Alpine. Let's move on to the 5th best team, which was Daniel Ricciardo. Notice I didn't mention Yuki because Yuki was in 7th place. I don't know what happened to Yuki, but he ended up not even scoring points. And then obviously he missed the national anthem.
I was going to say that's what happened. He missed the national anthem.
Oh, poor guy in his short legs. But good race for Ricciardo. There's been a lot of talk about Danny Rick. He didn't get the Red Bull seat. Now, what's interesting about Checo, he got a 2-year extension, but it's a 1+1. So he's extended for next year, but that doesn't include the year after that. It's an option. So could that be for Yuki? Could that be for Ricciardo? Yuki got an extension, so I doubt it's for Yuki. But it is interesting that they didn't sign. It is a 2-year deal for Perez, but it's really only a 1+1. Are they potentially setting up Ricciardo here? I don't know, because Ricciardo really hasn't been good enough. But 8th place here is fine. He probably would have scored points without Sainz DNFing. So real good race for Ricciardo. 4 points is big for RB, especially when you look at Alpine scoring 3. Ricciardo on his own scoring 4 is pretty big. I thought Daniel did a good job. He qualified 7th. It was 6th or 7th. So he did fall back, but you can't be mad at that just because of everything that happened in this race. So good for RB. Then we got the Green Machines, Aston Martin. Great race for Lance Stroll. Fernando Alonso was battling with Hamilton for half the race. That was so exciting watching the 2 old men go back and forth. They kept going off the track, on and off, battling through all the safety cars, through all the carnage, really. It was still a 6th and 7th for Aston Martin, and that's good because they have really been declining. So 14 points is big here. I thought Lance in his home race, even though the fans don't really like him, which is funny. Lance in his home race getting 7th. It's cool. It's good enough. I thought for a team to get 6th and 7th with all these conditions and the way that it was, I think that's pretty big here. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I thought so too. I think this was a big race for Aston Martin to be able to finish in the top 10. We know that this team can podium. We know that this team can really be a contender for a podium spot on the grid. So it was great to see them kind of competing up towards the front today, or at least towards that, top 10 area. And yeah, overall, I just thought a really solid performance for Aston Martin today.
Yeah, I think it's big for them. It's a 6th and 7th place. Very often we see Fernando bringing in all the points for Aston Martin, which has kind of been their issue with Lance. But yeah, Lance getting 7th, it works out. Let's move on to the top 3 teams here, and it's say I did this wrong. It should be Red Bull, but my bad. Like I said, maybe we need a new host here. But Mercedes were actually the 2nd best team today. And it's a 3rd and 4th. And like I said, we talk a lot about Russell making these little mistakes. Ends up getting 3rd on the podium. It could have been more. But Mercedes out of nowhere. Like I said, George getting pole position. This was kind of George Russell's race to lose. And, those little mistakes costed him. Ended up getting 3rd. But Lewis did good the entire race. When's the last time we've seen Lewis, just in the podium position, battling for the podium, which has kind of, not been great for him. It could have been his first time in the podium since a long time ago, but it wasn't to be. But you can't be mad at Mercedes getting 3rd and 4th. This is very much back on track to where they were supposed to be. Dylan, are Mercedes back?
Apologies, I had to adjust that there. I do believe that Mercedes is trending.
Okay, that's fair.
I don't think that they're back yet. I think once Hamilton leaves and they figure out who their next person's driver is going to be, then we'll start seeing what Mercedes can fully be. But obviously, great run for Russell. Hamilton looked good today as well. Overall, solid performance for Mercedes. Should be very proud about their race today.
Yeah, I like you said, trending, because they could be trending back down again, depending on who they bring in. If they bring in Antonelli, it's like you kind of expect, rookie, probably down, probably the 4th or 5th best team. But I think everything's banking on 2026, the new car, for them to be top again. Let's move on to the team who scored the most points. I messed up. I'm sorry. McLaren were the best team today. 2nd place for Lando, 5th for Oscar. It could have been more for Oscar, really. But he kind of struggled with the Mercedes. There was a point where he was 3rd and ended up both Mercedes went by. He had the tangle with George Russell. McLaren, their team that's not trending, their team that is they are at the top right now. It's basically Red Bull, McLaren, Ferrari, although Ferrari, like I said, double DNF. McLaren, they got the win in Miami. They were 2nd in Imola. They were good in Monaco 2 weeks ago, and they get 2nd place again. Like, McLaren have scored the most points in F1 over the last 2 months, and a lot of that is because they have 2 fantastic drivers. Oscar is right there with Lando. Like I said, it probably should have been a 2nd and a 3rd, but once again, they bring in the most points on the weekend, and the sky is the limit for McLaren. This is a team that was terrible 2 years ago. They started Bahrain in 17th and 18th. And they've won races since then. They won with Ricardo. They won in Miami with Lando. And Lando was winning for a majority of this race. But once again, it was kind of poor planning. I feel like McLaren kind of lost the race for Lando because twice he had the lead. But because of bad pit stop, bad strategy, he ended up losing that. Never really ended up catching up to Verstappen in the end. So let's move on to Red Bull, where they were the 3rd best team. I messed up my graphic because Verstappen won the race, but Checo got last. So, Mr. Dillon here, to cap us off, is this becoming a problem for Red Bull where they're winning the race, but they're getting outscored by 2 other teams?
Yeah, I think for Red Bull, I mean, obviously you know what Verstappen's going to bring, but Checo Perez, I think, he's hit or miss occasionally. He's either going to be really, really good for you, or he's going to go all out and potentially DNF. So, I mean, overall, you look at, Max, obviously he's safe. And I think the big thing is what's Red Bull's future going to be like after the end of this year? Because obviously Adrian Newey's out, and then I expect a lot more changes to be made. And then 2026 rolls around and you get the new hybrid car. So, things are going to be different for Red Bull over the next few years. We'll see if much longer Red Bull's performance leash will be over
This is what I want to point out. So Perez is 5th in the standings. He's behind Sainz, who DNF'd this race and missed a race. So Sainz didn't score points in 2 different races, and he is ahead of Checo, who has raced in every race, but has failed to score points in 4 races out of the 9 or 10. It's not good. He's not scoring points in 30% of these races, and he's in a Red Bull where Verstappen has 194 points and Checo has 107. We're at a point where Piastri is about to catch him. One more good race by Piastri and one more bad race by Checo, and Piastri's in 5th. And it's just not good enough. You can't continue to do this. Red Bull, if Red Bull are winning the race, why are they getting outscored by Mercedes and McLaren? It's just not good enough. And you're at a point where it's like Checo is just not feeling confident in that car. You wonder why did they extend him? Is it because no one else is out there? Is that why?
Well, forget about it.
Because who can honestly replace Perez right now? I don't know. I really don't know, man. It's going to be interesting. I mean, like, this offseason's already kind of shaping up to be kind of a little bit of a wild one, and I don't really know. I mean, Carlos Sainz, maybe?
That's what I thought too, because the main thing that's coming from the Red Bull camp is that, we've had Perez the last 2 years and we won the championship the last 2 years. He's doing a great job at that. But when this is happening, like when Perez is 5th in the standings, you're relying a bit too much on Verstappen, because Verstappen's basically going to win you the championship by himself, because Perez is outscored by 3 other guys that's not Verstappen, like Leclerc, Sainz, and Norris have more points. If Ferrari didn't double DNF today, they would be right there. So, that argument of Perez doing enough to keep them winning, that's just not the case, because they, once again, got outscored in this race. So he's got to figure something out, because he's got progressively worse each year. He helped Verstappen win in the first year, for sure. We know that. He got 2nd place last year in the standings. But this year, it's just not the same. If this continues, where you have McLaren scoring, Ferrari scoring, we could see Red Bull not win the Constructors, even though Verstappen wins. So the race rating, it's a 10 out of 10. It was the best race of the year so far. The best races are often the races that Verstappen doesn't win. But this is a weird case, because Verstappen did win the race, but he won the race on merit, right? They had good strategy. He was fast. He capitalized on other people's mistakes. Lando could have won this race. Russell could have won this race. Or Verstappen could have won this race. That ended up being the podium, and Verstappen ended up winning. Still a 10 out of 10, the first one of the year. Woo! Let's go. So will we have another one? Will we have another 10 out of 10 race? Who knows? Where are we going next? That's a good question. We are going to Spain next, in Austria. We're going to be doing our European tour here. We got Spain, Austria, Great Britain, Hungary, Belgium, Netherlands, Italy. So we got 7 European races coming up. So get ready for those 9 a.m. races. That's what we like. So yeah, that's all we got. Dylan, you got anything to wrap us up here?
I got nothing. This was a good show.
Great show. Great show.